I want to start by telling you a story. This is a story that I covered for CBC Radio a few years ago. And it's actually a bit of a seminal story for me. I'll let you know why in a minute. But the story itself actually happened here in Calgary, my hometown. Perfect time for an applause break, thank you. But it happened a few years back, and some of you might remember this. It was when the short-lived but highly anticipated Calgary Aquarium closed its doors. You know, the aquarium director had kind of said, well, we've got to close our doors. There's simply not attendance. People are not coming. Maybe it's because Alberta's landlocked. You know, maybe there wasn't that natural curiosity towards sea life. But they had to close their doors. And it left the aquarium in kind of a very tricky spot. What to do with these fish? You know, you can't just simply release them back into the wild. They've lost their natural instinct, so that's not a possibility. You can't transfer them to another aquarium. I mean, just trying to transport some of these large animals would be very stressful on them. Or you also run into the risk of cross-tank contamination. So that wasn't a possibility. So the aquarium director made a tricky decision that turned out to be quite controversial. And that was that on a beautiful Saturday afternoon, they were going to invite Calgarians down to the aquarium, and you could go in and point to any fish in any tank, and they would take that fish and they'd put it out in the parking lot and grill it over open coals. You know, and it was a great opportunity for Calgarians, who'd never tried barbecued sea otter. Or grilled manatee. And the aquarium director thought, based on the success of pancake breakfasts, Albertans love eating in parking lots. So, at this point, I think it's fair to say that's not a true story. And it's possible that some people might have believed that for a little bit. I mean, it's possible there's some people out there literally thinking, I wonder what that tastes like. How did I miss that? No. I hope that's not a possibility. But it's possible that you might have believed that for a little bit, right? I mean, I'm standing in front of the TEDx sign. I'm on a red dot. I've got a beautifully pressed shirt. There's a lot of reasons why you should believe me. But the content of what I said is ridiculous and mildly illegal. But if you fell for any part of that story, I want you to know that you're not alone. Because when we first broadcast that comedy story, we received hundreds and hundreds of phone calls from Canadians concerned that Calgarians were at an aquarium barbecue. This is just a sample of some of those calls.
The story about the Calgary Aquarium shutting down, what they're doing with the animals is they're going to eat them.
I think this is absolutely outrageous and disgusting.
And very disgusting.
Disgust.
I don't know how people are getting away with this.
They're going to grill up the fish and the sea otters?
I've never heard of anything quite so barbaric.
They have said they're going to have a grill out?
I think it's very disturbing.
I don't know, it just sounds really, I don't know, not mean, but just weird.
I just feel absolutely outraged. What's going on here?
I'm sure there's people out there that feel the same way. This is shocking to me, and I just hope it's a joke.
It was a joke. He got it in the end. But I told you before that this was a seminal story. And I actually meant that. Because that story ran in the second episode of a satirical comedy show that I do called This Is That. And that was the first indication that we had that anybody would take our comedy stories as a real story. So in some level of thinking, 7 years ago, we were making fake news. I mean, that was way before Donald Trump made it popular. But I will tell you this, that wasn't our intention. When we first started working on the show, myself, Pat Kelly, and Chris Kelly, our idea was just simply to parody the sound of public radio, to parody the sound of CBC. That we wanted to have this platform to do ridiculous characters, to do outrageous interviews, outlandish documentaries, but we didn't want to make it too obvious. We wanted to sort of serve it up in a very earnest, dry, public radio tone, CBC. Because we thought that juxtaposition is funny. It's funny. And we wanted to sort of do a very accurate job of it. So we actually met with a senior producer, a radio producer at CBC. And we said, if we want to really sound like CBC, do you have any pointers, any insider information? And she said, well, yeah. I mean, on our news stories on the radio, we have certain formats that we put our news into. And I was like, huh? Formats? I thought news, isn't it? You just interview someone, they spout off a bunch of facts, then you move on to the next person, they spout off a bunch of facts. That's news. But she was like, no, I mean, we put our stories into certain formats. And so she shared with us some of these formats. One of them is called a double ender, which is when a host decides that they're going to cover a story, and they want to have two differing opinions. The first person comes on for maybe about a minute, maybe they're on the phone, it's a monologue. The host interjects, has a little perspective, and then the second person comes on, they give a little monologue. That's a double ender. Another story is called a freight train. That's when a host decides that they want to have a bunch of sound bites, a bunch of different little sound bites throughout the story, like boxcars on a freight train, one after the other, after the other, after the other, a freight train. Another one was called a talk tape. A talk tape is when two hosts, you have heard this, when two hosts are sitting in studio together and they're having a scripted conversation. And it sort of sounds a little stilted, like they're trying to pass it off as though it's very casual, they're just off the cuff, but something's a little stilted because it's scripted. And there's different sound ups that they play throughout their conversation that support their story. Well, first of all, when I heard that, and I started listening to radio, I started to kind of pick up on those. And I realized, oh my gosh, I mean, I guess subconsciously they've always been there. And I didn't really pick up on it. Maybe I sort of knew, but I didn't really pick up on it. But what we found is that when we put our ridiculous stories into those formats, people really believed them. Like, every episode of the show that we've ever done, we receive hundreds of calls. Anyone familiar with the show, every single listener feedback is a real person. That's not us. And so what it tells me is that, for some people, in trying to determine truth, that maybe form and tone are actually more important than content. Which is kind of weird because you sort of go, well, if I'm seeking the truth, I would probably do the digging into the content. But actually, maybe for some, it's form and tone. There's an old saying that's, how do you sell a big lie? You surround it by truth, and it makes it more palatable. And so on some level, our ridiculous stories are the big lie. And the truths are that the tone sounds familiar, the form is in a way that I recognize as something I associate with being truthful, and so somehow they overlook the actual story. Now, it wasn't just listeners that were falling for our stories. We were pretty floored to find out that legitimate news organizations took some of our stories as true, and not just a few organizations. We did a story about a bylaw in Montreal, that all dogs in Montreal would be mandated to understand commands in both official languages. English and French. That story was covered as true by New York Magazine. Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer, also tweeted out, "Dogs don't understand language different," like... It's kind of the point. We did another story about a youth sports league who, in order to address the negative effects of competition, that a youth soccer league decided to remove the ball from soccer. So it's just kind of kids running around, kicking the air, right? If someone said they scored, I guess you did. If someone said, I saved it, I guess you did. Everybody wins because nobody knows what's happening. That story was covered as true by Fox Sports. And by the Washington Times. And many others. Harper's Magazine has taken one of our stories and run with it as true. The National Post took one of our stories and ran with it as true. And I mean, the crazy thing is, maybe it's because they're in this quick turnaround. If they find a headline, they want to churn out content, something that grabs attention, something that clicks on their page. But truthfully, if they wanted to do any of the due diligence, all they would have to do is find a secondary source on our story. Because really, we were the only ones that were reporting that in Montreal, dogs need to be able to understand both English and French. But that didn't happen. And to their credit, they did retract the story once they realized it was satire. But in some level, the damage had already been done. It seems to me that we're in this minefield of information. And we kind of have to navigate this to try to figure out, well, what's true, what's not true. And sometimes, we think of our show as like this booby trap, that's kind of saying, hey, you can't believe everything that you read or see. You engage the critical part of your mind. It's important. It's important. And if you stumble across one of our stories and it explodes, the hope is that you get a laugh. Our intention is comedy. And maybe you get some perspective. But if you step on another news story, a fake news story, a news story with a very different agenda, and it explodes, that has the power to change elections, right? To change millions of lives. We have this, just a weird way that we measure when one of our satirical stories is successful. Pat and Chris and I. I'll let you in on our secret, which is that when we have this fake story, a fake issue that we have created, when we get listener response, feedback, vehemently arguing both sides of a fictitious issue, we kind of feel like, well, we've struck a chord somehow. We did this weird story. It's really kind of an unusual one, and we didn't really think too much of it. It was about a politician who said that we need to change the Canadian flag. We need to get rid of the maple leaf on the Canadian flag. I was the politician, by the way. Because the concern is that in countries that don't have maple trees, they wouldn't recognize what a maple leaf is. And the big danger is that they might mistake it for a pot leaf. We received hundreds of calls. Some people saying, finally, someone has said it. I have worried about this for years. Other people calling in saying, I think it's great. We should celebrate our progressive laws. Someone else called in and said, I also take issue with that it's a maple leaf, not because it looks like a pot leaf, but because a leaf says nothing. It's a leaf. It's weak. We need an image on our flag that projects strength, a bear's paw or a cougar's tooth. And someone else called in and said, it has nothing to do with the image. My problem's with the color. Red has been a long-standing liberal agenda. Satire holds up a mirror to ourselves. We can see ourselves. Hopefully we see ourselves. We get some perspective. We can see ourselves in the callers. We can see where they went wrong. We can see what it is that they see in a story that's on their chest that they need to get off their chest. But hopefully we see ourselves a little bit. We get a bit of a laugh. We see our biases. Biases are a huge one because really it's biases that fake news plays on. And I know this because we play on it. It's not by accident that we set the aquarium story in Calgary. I'm Albertan. I grew up here. I know that outside of Alberta, some people might have a predisposition to a way of thinking about what Albertans are, generalizations about who Albertans are. We're cowboys, renegades, the Wild West, the Texans of Canada. Wouldn't surprise me what Albertans are throwing on grills. They love to eat in parking lots. But these biases, recognizing these biases is a big thing. Especially now, because it seems to me that, we used to go out and seek information, right? If you wanted to find something out, you would go and get a paper. You would turn on the 6 o'clock news. You would go to an encyclopedia. You would actively do that. Now, it feels like the information seeks us out. It comes to us. It bombards us. But the thing is that the information that finds us on our social media feeds, on our telephone, a headline that grabs, an update, breaking news, the information that finds us is already pre-filtered through our biases and beliefs. It's based on our online footprint. It's based on our preferences already, our interests, our habits, things that we already believe. And the trick is that in a way of thinking, it's kind of like, if we're not careful, we can be inside this bubble. And really, that's what fake news wants. It doesn't want you to step outside and seek other information. And so inside this bubble, it could mean that we are more likely to fall for a story. We could be more gullible. But I think in a larger context, the other trap is that we literally could be trapped in an echo chamber of our own beliefs. And so I think the challenge is to make sure that we step outside of our bubble. Seek other perspectives, some of which really might not agree with our own. Engage the critical part of our mind. Have a laugh at ourselves. Laughing at our biases. It's funny. If you kind of have a bias and you recognize it and you laugh at it a little bit, somehow that illuminates it. That sort of sets it free just a little bit. And I think that maybe if we all do this, if we look for other perspectives, if we find other points of view, that maybe, hopefully, for all of us, we'll simply get a little bit closer to the truth. Thank you, Calgary.